In the summer of 1834, a storm of rumors swept through rural Virginia, whispers carried from taverns to parish steps, stories too grotesque to be believed. Farmers spoke of wagons arriving at night to the Sullivan estate, their wheels muffled with cloth, their drivers silent as shadows. By day, the sprawling farmhouse near Appomattox Courthouse appeared ordinary, a place of orchards, cattle, and respectable family life. But beneath its stone foundations lay a secret so monstrous that even seasoned federal marshals would later confess they had never witnessed its equal. When the raid came, led by men carrying both lanterns and iron bars, they expected contraband whiskey or hidden weapons from the recent unrest. Instead, they broke into a basement where 47 children sat chained to the walls, their eyes hollow from hunger, their skin bruised from irons that had never been loosened. Some were no older than 4. Others had grown into their teens in the dark, their voices cracked from years of silence. The discovery did not just expose the Sullivans as cruel kidnappers, it revealed an organized network of human trafficking stretching across state lines, a machinery of exploitation that preyed on orphans, runaways, and even children stolen from their own families. The ledgers found in that basement listed names, dates, and destinations, as if the children were inventory rather than living souls. Tonight we peel back the plaster of history and descend into that cellar of horrors, where innocence was shackled and sold, and where America's promise of freedom revealed one of its darkest betrayals. What happened in Virginia in 1834 is not merely a tale of crime, it is a story of how evil can hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability until the walls themselves are forced to speak. Before we descend further into the Sullivan family's chilling secrets, make sure you are subscribed and turn on notifications so you never miss the forgotten horrors we uncover each week. Share in the comments where you're listening from, because history's darkest truths often hide closer to home than we want to believe. If this story already sends shivers down your spine, leave a like and pass it along to someone who dares to confront the shadows of America's past. Virginia in the year 1834 was a place balanced uneasily between the fading memory of revolution and the looming presence of slavery, poverty, and economic transformation. The counties around Appomattox Courthouse were dotted with tobacco farms, small mills, and estates that once held greater prominence than their present condition revealed. Families clung to respectability even as debts mounted and social divisions deepened. It was within this environment that the Sullivan family appeared as a fixture of tradition, known by name in church records and court proceedings, but never openly accused of what they concealed beneath their house. The settlement where they lived was not a bustling town, but rather a scattered community bound together by parish meetings, traveling merchants, and seasonal gatherings. The courthouse was the hub of order, its clerks maintaining meticulous ledgers of births, deaths, and land sales, while the tavern across the square carried gossip faster than any formal notice. In such a landscape, secrets could thrive, particularly when reinforced by wealth or intimidation. Families who appeared pious on Sunday could hide darker truths on weekdays, shielded by the silence of neighbors who preferred not to challenge those with influence. The Sullivan estate, a modest yet imposing structure of brick and timber, sat along a road often traveled by wagons moving westward. To outsiders, it suggested stability and quiet prosperity. Fields stretched behind it, an orchard grew in neat rows, and livestock grazed in view of passers-by. The family's patriarch, Patrick Sullivan, was noted in tax rolls as a man of means, owning more acreage than many of his peers. Yet beyond official records, his reputation was more ambiguous. Some spoke of sudden bursts of violence, of unexplained absences, of strange activity at night, when lanterns glowed behind shuttered windows. Such observations were often dismissed as exaggerations born of jealousy For in rural Virginia, reputations were fragile and slander an easy weapon. The broader context of the time provided fertile ground for exploitation. Virginia's cities, from Richmond to Lynchburg, were struggling with the consequences of rapid industrialization and the shifting demands of agriculture. Families fractured by debt or disease often left children orphaned. The roads carried countless migrants searching for work or passage westward, and among them were the vulnerable, young runaways, widows' children, and the abandoned offspring of men lost to alcohol or war service. These children became prey for those who viewed human lives as commodities, whether in the sanctioned system of slavery or in the clandestine markets that thrived in shadows. In official reports later filed by marshals, there were references to missing children whose names had appeared on church registers but had vanished without burial records. Families spoke in hushed tones of sons and daughters who disappeared from roadside camps, from markets, from isolated homesteads. The law provided little remedy, for suspicion alone carried no weight, and many believed that wolves, disease, or the dangers of the road were the only explanation. Against this backdrop, the Sullivans cultivated an outward image of normalcy that concealed the basement where chains rattled and voices were silenced. The community around the estate was bound by silence, some born of ignorance and others of fear. Laborers who worked near the Sullivan property reported hearing noises at night, muffled sounds that did not belong to the wind or the animals. A few claimed to have seen children's faces at upper windows, fleeting and pale, though no children were known to live in the house. These accounts were never pressed, for the Sullivans carried an air of menace that discouraged inquiry. Neighbors preferred distance, convincing themselves that what they heard or saw was imagination rather than evidence. Religious life offered little protection, for the local parish had long tolerated contradictions between faith and cruelty. Records from the time show baptisms, marriages, and funerals conducted with solemn ceremony, while whispers of brutality and disappearances remained outside the sanctuary walls. Preachers urged moral conduct, but they also cautioned against gossip, creating an atmosphere where uncomfortable suspicions could be buried under sermons about sin and redemption. In this silence, the Sullivans' operations continued unchecked, their farmhouse standing as a landmark of both respectability and dread. By the early 1830s, tension in the region was heightened by broader political events. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 had shaken Virginia with terror and retribution, leaving white families paranoid and tightening their grip on control. The fear of insurrection created fertile ground for secrecy, for authorities focused their attention on potential uprisings rather than on crimes committed by those in positions of local influence. In this climate, the disappearance of poor or orphaned children raised little alarm compared to the specter of rebellion. The Sullivans exploited this imbalance, hiding their crimes beneath the larger anxieties of the era. The environment, therefore, was one of contradictions. A society that professed morality but tolerated silence, a community that valued order but overlooked absence, a landscape where the vulnerable slipped through cracks, too wide to be mended. Into this world, the Sullivan family wove their darkness, transforming their basement into a place where humanity was reduced to ledgers, and children became numbers rather than names. By the time federal marshals arrived, the horror was not a sudden eruption, but the result of years of neglect, secrecy, and a community willing to look away. The Sullivan household functioned as a hierarchy disguised as family, a structure with roles assigned not by affection, but by utility. Patrick Sullivan occupied the center as a calculating steward of land and ledger, a man whose public piety and punctual tithes masked the steady arithmetic of acquisition. Beside him, Margaret Sullivan presented domestic order, accounts of flour, candles, vinegar, and linen, baskets to parish fairs, baskets to the poor. Her inventories were the facade behind which other inventories were kept. 2 adult sons did the night work, one proficient with horses and harness, the other with locks, chains, and improvised carpentry. Their tasks intersected at the threshold of the basement door, where iron met timber with an efficiency that did not require words. A hired man, seldom addressed by name and paid in cash, moved between outbuildings and creek crossings, his value measured by silence and distance traveled without incident. The estate's small economy provided the cover. Orchards produced barrels that traveled to market. A smokehouse cured meat for sale at road stands. A weaving room turned out coarse cloth that circulated through neighboring farms. These honest products provided a rhythm of carts, hands, and invoices that made late-night movement plausible and steady deliveries unremarkable. Hidden among crates of apples and tarred canvas were objects that did not belong to agriculture. Child-sized irons, lengths of braided rope without fray, corked bottles labeled by hand for sleep, for nerves, for seasickness. In a separate ledger, written in a more deliberate hand, were entries tied to none of the crops. No 12 male small indenture prepared, no 18 sibling pair quiet hold. Remit 2 by packet to Petersburg delivery on dock agreed. Local structures of authority helped without intending to help. The parish accepted donations that kept candles burning through winter and named the Sullivans in lists of benefactors, which insulated them from idle accusations. The magistrate knew the family through land disputes and polite petitions for improvements to the road and considered them orderly petitioners who strengthened the county's appearance of respectability. A physician, summoned often enough to treat the household's laborers, learned not to ask questions about bruises attributed to farm mishaps, and children described as apprentices who had not yet learned sense. When laudanum appeared in quantities larger than simple headaches would require, there were no receipts preserved that could contradict the explanations. Acquisition relied on the vulnerabilities of the age. Indenture laws permitted the binding of poor children to masters for training. Guardianship affidavits could be fabricated with a name, a cross, and a witness paid to swear. Roadside taverns hosted unaccompanied youths on market weeks, and ferry landings swelled with families breaking camp in the dusk. The Sullivans learned to recognize the look of children on the edge of displacement. A girl sent ahead to buy candles. A boy left with the wagon while adults bargained for flour. A pair of siblings trailing behind a party at a creek crossing. Offers of food, talk of work, a promise to fetch a minister or a constable created delays measured in minutes, then hours, then absence. For those whose names would be missed in city parishes, there were forged letters forwarded by acquaintances who did not exist. For those whose names were never written, the silence required no explanation. The house itself contained the system. The entry hall's polished wood kept visitors facing upward toward framed certificates and away from the trap cut clean behind a settle that never scraped. The basement was divided with care, a first chamber with a pump and lime for smell, a second with shelves of folded burlap and spare clothing marked by size, a third with wall rings at measured intervals, and a tally cut into plaster where chalk marks could be counted and erased. Chains differed in weight, some padded in old cloth to prevent swelling and noise. Barrels of water were kept full against the risk of inspection, a discipline as constant as the sweepings that carried footprints into the refuse heap behind the smokehouse. Paper completed what iron began. The trafficking network required names of receiving parties. In other jurisdictions, farmers requiring hands, shopkeepers promising training, captains willing to look away at river landings. A small circle of intermediaries handled conveyance, a carter who knew secondary roads passable in rain, a boatman who favored pre-dawn departures, a clerk who stamped apprenticeship forms without scrutiny when presented at the end of the month. payments moved in layered forms, coin for the lowest rung, notes for the middlemen, and at the top, the concealment of transactions within legitimate bills of lading. Phrases within the private ledger standardized the trade as if it were a craft. Temperament, compliant. Health, diminished, move quickly. Attachment, twin separate at second station. The last line repeated often enough to become the operation's quiet doctrine. Neighbors registered anomalies but filed them under caution. Dogs sounded at the Sullivan Lane on nights without moon. Lanterns crossed fields when no harvest demanded overtime. Wagons rolled without the jingle of trace chains because leather had been wrapped to dull the sound. Some families noted that laundry lines occasionally displayed small garments when no children were publicly claimed in the house. Others recalled a series of hastily filled pits near the far fence, later explained as drainage improvements. When strangers came to ask about missing sons or daughters, they were directed to crossroads, to ferries, to rumors of employment in distant sawmills. They were here, some were told by a hand on a gate, but moved on before dawn. That phrase became the compromise between what was known and what one could safely say. Rumor reached print in glancing ways. A notice in a Richmond sheet requested information on a light-haired boy last seen on the Appomattox Road. A broadside from farther north carried an offer of reward for a sister lost between tavern and ferry. None named the Sullivans, yet each described paths that converged near their acreage. Among postal inspectors, there circulated an observation: uncharted traffic on a secondary route, irregularly spaced but persistent, accompanied by parcels heavy for their listed contents. It was in such clerical margins that the first administrative attention formed, not as outrage, but as curiosity tied to missing postage and misdeclared freight. Within the basement, systems hardened into routine. Food arrived in measured portions to prevent waste and noise. Sleep was regulated by darkness maintained even at midday. Illness was handled with remedies that rendered children passive. The dosages adjusted to avoid death that would complicate transfer. Siblings were separated early to blunt memory. Those who clung to one another were spent last, their ledger lines annotated with delays. Chalk numbers on plaster told their own chronology, added, erased, replaced as shipments moved. The efficiency was not spontaneous but learned, refined season by season, improved as failures were catalogued in a script that imitated the precision of trade. By the spring of 1834, the various strands legal indifference, parish respectability, forged apprenticeships, and night traffic masked by honest commerce had woven themselves into a fabric that appeared durable. The estate looked like any other, its books balanced, its fields productive, its owners present at funerals and fairs. What distinguished it could not be seen from the lane: a basement arranged to neutralize sound, a set of papers that turned human beings into entries, a network that profited from the geography of a nation in motion. The Sullivans had built a machine calibrated to the weaknesses of their time, confident that the parts would continue to mesh so long as neighbors preferred not to look directly and officials valued order more than detail. The discovery that would follow was not a sudden crack in a flawless wall, but the point at which accumulated scratches finally aligned and the structure's hidden blueprint revealed itself. The summer of 1834 began like many others in the rural counties of Virginia, with harvests underway and families preoccupied with the demands of farm life. But beneath the routine, unease was spreading. Stories circulated about children who had gone missing from nearby towns and villages. At first, these disappearances were dismissed as accidents, runaways perhaps, or tragedies of wandering too close to rivers and forests. Yet the frequency grew too pronounced to ignore. By June, 3 children from different communities had vanished without explanation. Families whispered that something unnatural was at work. The first disappearance directly tied to the Sullivan estate occurred on a Sunday afternoon. 6-year-old Thomas Bailey, the youngest son of a blacksmith, failed to return from delivering bread to a neighbor's house less than a mile from his home. His shoes were later found near the edge of the old Appomattox Road, as though he had been lifted from the earth without leaving a trace. The local sheriff organized a search, but no tracks, no signs of struggle, no evidence of wolves or highwaymen appeared. Mothers began keeping their children indoors. Fathers carried muskets even on short walks. Weeks later, a second case chilled the community. 9-year-old Eliza Carter, described in the Parish Register as a lively girl with red hair and a fondness for hymns, vanished during a midsummer fair. She had been seen last near a merchant's stall, laughing with friends. Moments later, she was gone. Panic spread across the fairgrounds, and accusations flew at traveling peddlers and strangers. The search stretched until dawn, with lanterns sweeping fields and barns, but no trace of Eliza was ever found. The absence of witnesses or sounds of distress convinced some that she had been taken swiftly and deliberately by someone who knew the land and its patterns. Rumors sharpened into suspicion when the names of the missing children were compared in the county court records. Each family lived within walking distance of the Sullivan property. Though the connection seemed tenuous, the pattern gnawed at those who could not accept coincidence. The Sullivans were respected family owners of land, livestock, and a large farmhouse built of stone, but they were also distant, their estate guarded by high fences and hired men who discouraged curiosity. Neighbors recalled hearing wagons arrive late at night, their wheels muffled, their cargo hidden beneath tarps. The suspicions might have remained whispers if not for what happened in August. A storm swept across the county, and in its aftermath, a farmer discovered skeletal remains, washed out from a shallow grave near a creek that bordered Sullivan land. The bones, small and fragile, were unmistakably those of a child. The coroner could not identify the remains, but townsfolk remembered the missing names: Thomas, Eliza, and others whose absence hung heavily in the air. Fear became outrage, and the sheriff sent word to federal marshals who had already been investigating reports of child trafficking along the eastern seaboard. The marshals arrived quietly, posing as merchants at first, gathering testimony in taverns and parish houses. What they heard painted a picture too consistent to dismiss. Wagons traveling by moonlight toward the Sullivan estate, children vanishing in numbers that defied coincidence, the discovery of bones on land connected to the family. These fragments built a case strong enough to warrant a raid. The first incident that pulled the mask from the Sullivan family then was not a single disappearance, but the convergence of many a trail of missing children, a grave disturbed by stormwater, and records that revealed how all roads of suspicion led back to one estate. The community, once silent in fear of offending a powerful family, now demanded action. As preparations for the raid began, the Sullivans carried on their routines with outward normalcy. Church attendance, estate management, and social courtesy gave no hint of what lay beneath their home. But those who had glimpsed the covered wagons, who had heard faint cries carried on night winds, felt certain that a reckoning was near. The horror would soon break into daylight. But in that summer of 1834, the first incident, the vanishing of innocents and the storm that unearthed bones, was enough to shift whispers into cries for justice, and to mark the beginning of one of the darkest revelations in Virginia's history. By the time the leaves began to turn in the autumn of 1834, the county surrounding Appomattox had become a place of suspicion and dread. The disappearance of Thomas Bailey, the vanishing of Eliza Carter at the Midsummer Fair, and the discovery of skeletal remains near the creek had already shaken confidence in the safety of children. What followed deepened the unease into outright terror. Families began keeping meticulous watch over their households, yet still more children went missing. In September, the Morgan twins, aged 8, vanished from their own yard while their mother was inside kneading bread. The family lived scarcely 2 miles from the Sullivan estate, and the trail of small footprints ended abruptly near the road that passed in front of the Sullivan orchard. Neighbors searched day and night, their lanterns swinging over cornfields and fence rows, but no trace of the children appeared. October brought a new horror when a hunter discovered scraps of fabric in the woods east of the estate. The cloth bore patterns recognized as part of the dress Eliza Carter had been wearing on the day she disappeared. Alongside the fabric lay iron manacles small enough to fit a child's wrist, their hinges rusted but still functional. The discovery spread rapidly through the parish, convincing many that the missing were not victims of accident or wilderness, but of deliberate capture. Livestock deaths on neighboring farms began to be whispered about as connected to the same dark force. Farmers reported finding their cattle mutilated or their chickens slaughtered without cause. Though such events were not uncommon in rural life, the timing and frequency led many to believe that someone or something was practicing cruelty on animals before turning fully upon children. The link between the deaths of livestock and the vanished innocents was not proven, but in the minds of the fearful, they were inseparable signs of escalating evil. The parish priest attempted to calm his congregation, insisting in his sermons that the devil preys on fear and that rumors of conspiracy could divide a community as surely as disease. Yet even he could not deny that a strange malaise seemed to hang over the region. During funerals, during baptisms, and even during ordinary services, mothers clutched their children with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. By late autumn, whispers grew sharper and more focused. Testimony gathered by marshals from traveling merchants suggested that the Sullivan property was known as a waypoint for wagons seen only at night. One carter, questioned in Lynchburg, described being offered coin to deliver sealed crates to the edge of the Sullivan orchard, with instructions never to ask questions and never to approach the house. He claimed that the crates were unusually heavy for their size and that faint sounds inside suggested more than cargo. Such accounts, though difficult to verify, began circulating widely, fueling suspicions that the estate concealed an operation larger than a single family's misdeeds. The anxiety of the community deepened when the autumn rains unearthed another shallow grave, this time containing the partial remains of 2 children. The coroner's report, sparse in detail, noted iron staining on the bones, consistent with prolonged contact with chains. The official explanation listed the deaths as unidentified casualties of neglect or exposure, but in households and taverns alike, the consensus was far darker. Neighbors recalled peculiarities that now seemed ominous in hindsight. The way Patrick Sullivan had expanded the cellar beneath his farmhouse under the pretense of grain storage, the high fences erected around the property, and the sudden wealth that appeared to flow into the household, despite no visible increase in agricultural output. Where once these details had been dismissed as eccentricities of a prosperous landowner, they now seemed like evidence of calculated concealment. The fear spread beyond Appomattox. Families in nearby counties heard the rumors and forbade their children from traveling unaccompanied. Markets and fairs that once bustled with laughter now carried an atmosphere of unease. Children no longer played freely along the roads but were kept close by their parents' sides. The sheriff received reports from across the region of attempted abductions, suspicious wagons, and strange men seen near schools and churches. Many of these reports proved unverifiable, but the volume alone suggested a crisis of unprecedented scale. Within the Sullivan household, the facade of normalcy remained intact. The family attended church with regularity, their pew polished and orderly, their voices steady in hymn. Patrick offered donations to parish funds, Margaret supervised bake sales, and the adult sons exchanged pleasantries with neighbors when chance demanded. Yet behind their civility, the estate grew more fortified, its windows shuttered earlier in the evening and its boundaries patrolled by hired men with lanterns. What was presented as vigilance against thieves appeared to others as an attempt to shield secrets from view. By November, the marshals concluded that local authorities were either too intimidated or too complicit to act decisively. Their records show increasing frustration at the sheriff's unwillingness to issue warrants, citing lack of evidence despite mounting circumstantial proof. In private, several deputies admitted fear of confronting a family as entrenched and resourceful as the Sullivans. The marshals began preparing their own strategy, gathering intelligence quietly, knowing that one decisive event would be required to justify a direct raid. The escalation of 1834, then, was marked not by one spectacular event, but by a cascade of disappearances, discoveries, and growing suspicion that transformed unease into dread. The missing children, the shallow graves, the strange cargoes, and the fortified estate combined into a picture that left the community in paralysis. The silence of officials only deepened the conviction that the truth was being hidden. It was clear that something larger than rumor was at work, and that the shadow emanating from the Sullivan property had already consumed too many lives to be dismissed as coincidence. The stage was set for confrontation. The marshals who had once come to the county as observers were now preparing to act. What remained uncertain was how much horror would be revealed once the doors of the Sullivan basement were finally forced open. By the onset of winter, rumor began to harden into record. The federal marshals who had entered the county as cautious observers now compiled sworn statements, purchase slips, and parish lists into a pattern that no sermon could smooth away. A ferryman's ledger from the Appomattox crossing showed pre-dawn passages booked under shifting names, always paid in coin and always linked to a wagon described as tarred, muffled, no bells. A blacksmith in Farmville produced receipts for unusually small ironwork rings and shackles for dog training, as the customer had claimed, cut to circumferences that matched a child's wrist more than an animal's. A cooper who supplied the Sullivan estate admitted to fitting crates with padded interiors to protect glass, though no glass had ever been ordered. The crates were neither standard size nor standard weight. The notes simply read, "To for Petersburg, deliver by dusk." Clerical records corroborated the geography of absence. Parish registers contained a quiet tally of baptisms without corresponding burials or relocations. Names of children who appeared on Sunday lists and then ceased to exist on paper. A sexton's private diary kept for practical purposes of grave spacing and stone repair recorded small interments off-plot done at night to appease grieving families who feared contagion. When asked to point them out, he could not. Rains had shifted the edges of earth, and the markers, he admitted, were never meant to last. Medical notes supplied the first clinical spine to the case. The county physician, who had treated laborers on the Sullivan property, produced a bundle of receipts for laudanum, opiates, and antispasmodics, ordered in quantities inconsistent with routine farm injuries. In his notebook, he had once written, almost defensively, contusions blamed on machinery and falls, patterns regular around ankles and forearms, care requested for apprentices with poor sense. The marshals read that line twice. Another entry described a stable boy with wrist abrasions of uniform width bilaterally mirrored, a phrasing that, when paired with the blacksmith's receipts, suggested restraint rather than farm accident. Postal irregularities drew a federal eye where local custom would have looked away. A route inspector flagged parcels registered from intermediate depots to fictitious addressees near river landings. The sums declared were low. The weight declared was high. The handwriting repeated the same faults from town to town. When the inspector traced the hand to a clerk friendly with the Sullivans, he found apprenticeship papers, notarized at month's end for children whose guardians could not be located. The formula never varied. A cross beside a name, a witness with no fixed address, a destination noted as training. The land itself began to testify, surveyors walking the boundary between the Sullivan orchard and the creek found ventilation cuts disguised as stone chinks, low along the farmhouse foundation, narrow slits with interior soot and exterior lime scatter, the telltale powder used to suppress odor. Near the smokehouse, marshals lifted boards from a refuse heap and uncovered a trench filled with charred burlap, splintered cratewood, and small buckles distorted by heat. Along the far fence, shallow pits collapsed under the weight of their boots, releasing the smell of damp iron. It was here that a deputy unearthed a length of chain padded with stained cloth, its knots compacted with a waxy residue, testimony from the road's tied movement to method. A carter confessed to having hauled sleep crates to a packet boat captain who departed before sunrise, the cargo marked with chalk numbers and the word hold. He had never seen faces, only the quick hand that passed him coin and the warning to avoid the law's hour. A midwife described being called to distant farms to attend to apprentices, delivered faint and slow to wake. She had refused payment once and was never summoned again. A teacher from a neighboring county arrived with a list of truants whose names matched the parish registers near the Sullivan estate. The dates staggered, but the drift was steady. Children absent in one district were rumored alive in another, always in service, never in school. What the marshals lacked in direct sight, they replaced with convergence. They mapped night wagons against ferry logs, paired laudanum purchases with weeks when neighbors reported quiet. On the road, overlaid parish absences with the blacksmith's invoices, traced false apprenticeships to real boats, and marked every shallow grave found after storms. The lines crossed and thickened until the Sullivan property sat in the middle of a web that could no longer be called coincidence. One ledger, accidentally preserved by carelessness rather than conscience, tipped suspicion into certainty. Recovered from a barn loft used for drying cloth, it bore two styles of hand, a household book of flour, soap, and salt, ordinary entries that reassured and interleaved among them, a second script with measured strokes and sterile terms. No. 12 males, small indenture, prepared. Pair siblings separate at second station. Temperament, compliant. Health, diminished move, quickly. The dates tracked market days and river levels. The vocabulary erased personhood with the cadence of trade. Even those inclined to defend a respectable family found their explanations failing in the face of detail. The civic-minded donations, the punctual pew attendance, the tidy orchards could not reconcile with lime scoured into soil, with manacles shaped for wrists that had never lifted a plow, with receipts that purchased sedation by the dram. A magistrate who had argued for patience read the barn ledger and closed the book without a word. The sheriff, who had invoked lack of evidence, stood before the marshals as they laid out the map and, for the first time, did not object to warrants drafted in a foreign hand. The community shifted from fear to preparation. Mothers sewed names into the hems of their children's clothing. Fathers slept in turns with rifles unprimed but near at hand. Church deacons organized night watches that pretended to be for foxes and thieves. The priest, who had counseled against rumor, read a line from an older sermon, "When wolves dress as shepherds, the fold must learn to see." The marshals finalized their plan with a cold clarity learned from rivers and roads. Two teams would approach at first light when laudanum slowed hands and sleep held rooms. One would cross the orchard toward the house foundation, targeting the disguised vents and the interior stair. The other would set on the smokehouse and refuse trench to prevent the destruction of records and the flight of hired men with wagons ready. A third, drawn from local volunteers but kept ignorant of details to discourage betrayal, would seal the road to the ferry and the path toward the old mill where night wheels had been heard. What remained unknown was not guilt but scale. The ledger implied more names than graves could hold, more shipments than storms had exposed. The question that pressed against every plan was simple and unbearable. How many were still alive beneath the stone foundation? How many had been turned into columns of ink? And how much of the community's silence had purchased the time required to build a basement into a system? The evidence had ceased to whisper. It spoke in iron, lime, ledgers, and lists. The raid, no longer speculation, became the only remaining form of speech the law could make. Before we go further into the horrors surrounding the Sullivan family and the children discovered in their basement, take a moment to steady yourself. If this story has left you uneasy, if the weight of what we've uncovered makes your skin crawl, it means you're tuned to the same shadows history tried to bury. Share this video with someone who isn't afraid to look into the abyss. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to join our growing circle of those who confront the darkness others turn away from. What comes next will only grow more disturbing. At dawn on December 14, 1834, the federal marshals moved on the Sullivan estate. They had planned for weeks, marking maps, noting the times when wagons entered and left, cataloging the receipts of laudanum and shackles, and preparing iron bars for doors they suspected would be barred from within. The community, too terrified to act openly, had fed the marshals information in fragment sightings of covered wagons, the sound of chains beneath cellar vents, the uncanny silence of a house where children were sometimes glimpsed at windows yet never acknowledged. What began as rumor had hardened into evidence. The marshals advanced not to test suspicion but to confirm what was already feared. The estate lay in brittle silence that morning, its orchard covered in frost, the air thin with the smell of smoke from the hearth. Patrick Sullivan was seen briefly near the porch, his coat pulled tight, his eyes fixed on the approaching men. He did not flee. He simply turned and disappeared into the house. The marshals, lanterns raised and weapons ready, forced the door with iron bars and entered a home that looked like any other prosperous farmhouse of the time. The parlor was orderly, with a family Bible on the table, framed verses on the wall, and a neat fire in the grate. The kitchen smelled faintly of bread. But beneath this facade, the marshals found what they had anticipated: a locked trapdoor near the pantry, bolted twice over, its edges scuffed as if it had been used constantly. Breaking the locks required effort. As the door splintered open, a stench rose from below, heavy and unmistakable, the smell of lime, mildew, and unwashed bodies confined for too long. The marshals descended with lanterns, their boots echoing against the stone steps, and found themselves in a chamber that stretched under the entire length of the house. The reports preserved in their journals describe a sight that would haunt them until their deaths. 47 children sat or slumped against the walls, shackled by iron rings set at measured intervals. Some were too weak to rise, their limbs thin as reeds. Others looked up at the light with wide, hollow eyes that had not seen day for months, perhaps years. The basement was divided into 3 sections. In the first, barrels of water stood beside piles of burlap sacks and coarse clothing marked by size. In the second, chains were fixed at uniform distances, each with marks on the stone where children had worn grooves into the floor with their movements. In the third, ledgers and crates were stacked neatly, labeled with chalk numbers and destinations. The marshals opened one crate to find smaller iron manacles, folded cloth gags, and bottles of sedatives. The ledgers contained lists written in a precise hand. Number 23, female 9 Wires Petersburg. Number 24, male 7 Wires Richmond, pair siblings hold. It was an inventory that erased humanity and transformed children into cargo. Testimonies collected afterward describe the silence of that moment. The children did not cry when the marshals entered. They blinked at the lantern light, but made no sound, as if discipline and fear had taught them that noise brought punishment. Only after food and water were offered did murmurs begin, fragments of names, whispers of places they barely remembered, sobs from those old enough to know what freedom meant but too weak to celebrate. The marshals uncovered more than living victims. Along the far wall, beneath planks hastily nailed, they found shallow graves where bodies had been buried under lime. At least 6 were counted, though decomposition made exact numbers uncertain. The coroner later noted that the remains bore signs of long confinement, ankles scarred by chains, ribs protruding, and skulls too small for their recorded ages. The house had not merely confined children, it had consumed them. The Sullivans themselves did not resist. Patrick, Margaret, and their 2 adult sons were found in the parlor, seated in silence as if awaiting judgment. When confronted with the evidence, they offered no explanation, no denial. Only Margaret reportedly spoke, insisting that the children were apprentices under care, a phrase repeated in the ledgers. But the marshals had already seen enough to render such words meaningless. Outside, neighbors gathered at a distance, drawn by the commotion yet unwilling to come closer. Many had suspected, some had whispered, but few had dared to act. Now, watching the children carried from the basement, they confronted the cost of their silence. Families who had lost sons and daughters came forward in anguish, some recognizing faces long thought gone forever. Others found no trace of their missing children, realizing that the shallow graves contained the only answers they would ever receive. The raid uncovered documents that extended the horror beyond one basement. Letters were found addressed to contacts in Richmond, Petersburg, and ports along the Chesapeake, suggesting that the Sullivans had been part of a larger network trafficking children across state lines. Some letters bore initials rather than full names, coded to conceal identities, but enough details emerged to confirm that the operation was organized, not isolated. The children were not simply stolen, they were bought, sold, and shipped like goods, their fates recorded with the precision of merchants. The marshals sealed the estate, posting guards to prevent the destruction of further evidence. The children, too weak to travel far, were taken to a parish house where local women attempted to provide food, clothing, and comfort. Reports describe the difficulty of caring for them. Many were malnourished, their stomachs unable to hold solid food, their skin marked with sores. Some recoiled from touch, having known only restraint. Others clung desperately to their rescuers, whispering fragments of prayers or names of parents they barely remembered. The discovery spread rapidly through Virginia, carried by newspapers and word of mouth. 47 innocents rescued, one headline read, while another declared, "Hell found in Appomattox." For some, it was proof of the dangers that lurked within their own communities, hidden behind respectable facades. For others, it was an unbearable scandal, a stain on Virginia's reputation that officials sought to minimize. But the facts could not be buried again. The basement had been opened, and what it revealed was too monstrous to ignore. The climax of the Sullivan story, then, was not merely the breaking of a door or the freeing of captives. It was the unmasking of a system that had flourished because a community chose not to see, because officials hesitated to act, and because one family learned how to turn secrecy into profit. The chains on those children were physical, but they had been forged by silence, fear, and complicity, and once the marshals forced them open, the entire region was left to confront the truth that evil had been living in their midst, thriving in the shadows of respectability until daylight stripped it bare. The search of the Sullivan property extended for 3 days, and each hour seemed to deepen the enormity of the crime. Once the children had been removed from the basement and given to the care of parish volunteers, the marshals began a systematic examination of every outbuilding, every loft, every hidden compartment that might conceal further evidence. What they discovered confirmed that the Sullivan operation had not been an isolated crime of opportunity, but the center of an organized network that spanned counties and likely reached into other states. In the barn loft, beneath neatly stacked bales of hay, the marshals uncovered a trunk filled with correspondence. Many of the letters bore only initials for signatures, yet their contents spoke in plain terms of transactions. Shipment received 2 siblings, arrived, silent, payment enclosed, one read. Another, expect delivery at Richmond docks. Condition adequate, ensure no delay. The phrasing was cold, stripped of humanity, reducing children to commodities whose only recorded attributes were age, size, and obedience. Margins of some letters contained coded symbols, perhaps used by intermediaries to disguise the identities of buyers. Ledger books provided the most damning proof of scale. 3 volumes written in the same deliberate hand, listed children by number rather than name, with notations for health, temperament, and destination. Crossed-out entries suggested those who had died in confinement. At the back of one volume, a table tallied sums in pounds and dollars, amounts too large to have been earned from farm produce alone. These books, more than any testimony, demonstrated that the Sullivan family had conducted their crimes with a precision that mimicked the bookkeeping of merchants. Alongside the ledgers, the marshals discovered forged documents, apprenticeship contracts, guardianship affidavits, and travel permits bearing the signatures of men who could not be found. In many cases, the handwriting was identical, suggesting the work of a single forger within the household or among their accomplices. These papers allowed the transport of children to appear legitimate, granting cover to wagon drivers and boat captains who might otherwise have questioned their cargo. The forged contracts often named fictitious masters or distant relatives, a paper shield that protected the Sullivans from inquiry. The cellar itself yielded further horrors. Behind a false wall, investigators uncovered shelves of bottles labeled with crude notations: sleep, silence, long travel. Tests by physicians later confirmed the presence of laudanum and other opiates in concentrations strong enough to incapacitate a child. Cloth rags stained with chemical residue suggested their use in sedating captives before transport. Buckets of lime stored in the far corner revealed how the family had attempted to manage the odor of death from bodies buried within the basement itself. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a series of personal effects hidden in crates. Small shoes, scraps of clothing embroidered with initials, wooden toys, and locks of hair tied with ribbon. These objects, too valueless to sell, had been kept for reasons no one could explain. Some speculated that Margaret Sullivan preserved them as trophies. Others believed they were mementos taken to erase traces of identity. For the families who came searching, these fragments became the only proof that their children had lived, a cruel substitute for closure. The immediate fate of the Sullivans confounded expectation. After their arrest, they were transported under guard to the county jail, but within days conflicting accounts emerged. Some witnesses claimed that Patrick and his eldest son perished in a fire that swept through the jailhouse under suspicious circumstances. Others reported that bribes were offered, that officials complicit in the trade allowed their escape. Margaret and the younger son, too, vanished from the records shortly after being taken into custody. Whether they were killed by vigilantes, escaped with aid from accomplices, or silenced by higher authorities, remains unknown. This uncertainty bred new rumors. Some believed the Sullivans had not acted alone, but were part of a wider system, protected by men of influence who could not afford exposure. The disappearance of the family ensured that no formal trial took place, leaving the full extent of their operation untested in court. The ledgers and letters stood as evidence, but without defendants to confront, the legal process stalled. Officials issued vague statements about tragic accidents and justice pursued, but to the families of the missing, such words offered no comfort. The community fractured under the weight of revelation. Neighbors who had long ignored strange noises or unexplained wagons now faced accusations of willful blindness. Some admitted to suspicions but claimed fear of retaliation. Others insisted they had noticed nothing unusual. Churches that had once received donations from the Sullivans now confronted their own complicity in granting respectability to a family that hid atrocity beneath piety. Sermons shifted uneasily from condemnation to pleas for forgiveness. The rescued children became living reminders of what had been concealed. Many were too weak to survive long after liberation. Parish records note that at least a dozen died within weeks from malnutrition and disease. The survivors carried scars physical from chains, psychological from years of confinement that would never fade. Some were reunited with families who recognized them. Others remained nameless wards of the state, their identities erased by years in the basement. A handful grew into adulthood, though they seldom spoke of what they had endured. One survivor, decades later, described the silence of the cellar in a single phrase. "We learned not to cry because crying made them choose who would disappear next." The property itself became a site of unease. The house was abandoned, its orchard left untended, its fields overgrown. Local authorities debated whether to tear it down, but superstitions took hold. Travelers avoided the road that passed near it, claiming to hear chains rattling or children's voices in the wind. For years, the ruin stood as a silent monument to what had been uncovered, until eventually it collapsed under its own decay. Newspapers across the country carried the story, though details often blurred into sensationalism. Some editors emphasized the horror to sell copies. Others downplayed it to protect Virginia's reputation. Abolitionist presses seized upon the case as evidence of a culture that commodified human life, arguing that the Sullivans were not aberrations, but an extension of systemic cruelty. Southern loyalists countered that the case had been exaggerated, that the family were lone monsters, not representatives of society. In truth, the documents suggested both a particular crime made possible by broader indifference. The climax of the Sullivan story, therefore, was not resolved by a trial or execution. Instead, it ended in ambiguity. The children freed, but many dying. The perpetrators captured yet vanished. The network exposed but never dismantled. The ledgers remained. The graves remained. The memories of the survivors remained. But justice itself dissolved into rumor and silence. For the community, the discovery forced a reckoning with the price of looking away. Chains had clinked beneath the very foundations of a house visible to all, and yet for years no one had acted. The exposure of the Sullivan basement revealed not only the cruelty of one family, but the fragility of conscience when profit, fear, and reputation conspire to bury truth. And so the house at Appomattox passed into legend not as a relic of architecture, but as a place where daylight once struck stone and revealed the depths of human depravity. Its story echoed beyond Virginia, a warning that horrors concealed behind the mask of respectability can persist until forced open, and even then, justice may not hold them long. The aftermath of the Sullivan discovery spread like shockwaves across Virginia and beyond, embedding itself into the cultural memory of the 1830s in ways that officials struggled to suppress but could not erase. Once the basement had been opened and the chains unbolted, the county could no longer pretend ignorance. The children rescued that morning became living testaments, silent but undeniable evidence of what had been hidden behind stone walls and respectable facades. Yet, as with so many revelations of systemic horror, the consequences were uneven, complicated, and ultimately unsatisfying. The first consequence was immediate public outrage. Local newspapers published lurid accounts of the raid, emphasizing both the number of children discovered and the grotesque conditions in which they had been held. Headlines proclaimed 47 found shackled beneath Virginia farmhouse and hell discovered in Appomattox. Abolitionist presses seized upon the story, presenting it as proof that America's tolerance of bondage and commodification of human beings extended even into the treatment of its own children. When a society permits the sale of some, wrote one abolitionist editor, it should not be surprised to find that the sale of all follows close behind. The Sullivans became symbols of the darkest interpretation of human greed, their basement an allegory for systemic complicity. Local authorities, however, scrambled to regain control of the narrative. The sheriff, who only weeks earlier had resisted the marshal's suspicions, now presented himself as a man deceived by a cunning family. Magistrates issued public statements denouncing the Sullivans as aberrations, insisting that their crimes were singular, the work of a wicked few, not the reflection of this Commonwealth's good people. Yet the documents seized from the estate ledgers, letters, receipts, told a different story, one that suggested connections beyond the farmhouse walls. The discovery of coded correspondence linking the Sullivans to boat captains, clerks, and merchants forced the uncomfortable question of how many others had profited from the trade in stolen children. That question, though, was quietly buried by officials who feared its answers. The rescued children became wards of the state and the parish. In practice, this meant they were dispersed, some reunited with families who recognized them, some indentured to households under the guise of care, others placed in orphan asylums, already overcrowded. Contemporary reports suggest that of the 47, perhaps half survived into adulthood. Many were too malnourished, diseased, or traumatized to recover. Parish records show notes such as succumbed to fever, January, or died in sleep, February, grim reminders that liberation did not erase years of deprivation. Those who did survive rarely spoke of their confinement, but traces of their ordeal remained. One survivor, decades later, wrote in a private letter, "We learned to forget in order to live, but the smell of lime never left me." For the wider community, the exposure of the basement was a reckoning with silence. Neighbors who had long ignored the strange noises at night, the covered wagons that came and went, now faced accusations of willful blindness. Some confessed to unease but claimed fear had silenced them. Others insisted they had noticed nothing. In taverns and parish halls, arguments flared about complicity. Was silence itself a form of participation? Could a community plead innocence when the evidence had been so near? These questions lingered long after the estate itself had been abandoned. The fate of the Sullivan family deepened the unease. Official records claimed they perished in a jailhouse fire before trial, but persistent rumors suggested escape. Some whispered that powerful accomplices had ensured their disappearance to prevent testimony that might implicate others. Others claimed vigilantes had executed them in secret, their bodies buried in unmarked ground. Whatever the truth, the absence of a public trial meant that justice felt incomplete. The ledgers and crates remained, but the perpetrators slipped into ambiguity, leaving behind outrage without resolution. The estate itself became a cursed landmark. Attempts to sell the property failed. No family wished to live where chains had once clinked beneath the floorboards. Over time, the farmhouse collapsed into ruin, its orchard gone wild, its foundations overgrown. Local children dared each other to approach, telling tales of voices heard at night, of spectral children wandering fields. The legend of the Sullivan basement joined regional folklore, transformed into ghost stories that carried the truth in distorted form. For the people of Appomattox, the ruin was both reminder and warning, a physical scar in the landscape that could not be ignored. Nationally, the case fueled debates about morality and law. In abolitionist circles, it was cited as evidence that any system permitting human commodification, even indirectly, could metastasize into horrors such as the Sullivan basement. Southern loyalists countered that the family were isolated monsters, not representative of broader society. Yet even sympathetic newspapers in Richmond admitted that the scale of the crime suggested a network larger than one household. The crime was not born in one cellar, one editorial stated, but in the shadows where silence is profit. The long-term consequence was a paradox. The Sullivan story entered American memory not as an official case study, but as a cautionary tale whispered more often than written. Historians of the period noted the event, yet official records dwindled. The ambiguity of the family's fate, the absence of trials, the dispersal of surviving children into anonymity all ensured that the case hovered between documented fact and folklore. It was cited in pamphlets, in sermons, in abolitionist rhetoric, but it never became the cornerstone of reform that it might have been. Its horror was acknowledged but not fully confronted. Still, for those who had lived near Appomattox, the memory endured. Families who had lost children without explanation never forgot the day marshals carried pale, silent captives out of the Sullivan cellar. Parishioners who had once shaken hands with Patrick Sullivan or accepted Margaret's donations at fairs could not reconcile their former neighborly images with the evidence of ledgers and graves. The event fractured trust within the community, leaving wounds that persisted for generations. By the end of the century, as industrialization transformed Virginia, the ruin of the Sullivan house had decayed into near oblivion. Yet local lore kept the story alive. Farmers spoke of plows striking iron deep in the soil, of unearthed chains rusted but intact. School children repeated stories of ghostly cries. For some, the tale became a lesson in vigilance. Evil could flourish in silence behind the facade of respectability. For others, it was a source of shame, a reminder of complicity never fully atoned. The resolution of the Sullivan story, then, was no resolution at all. The children's liberation came too late for many. The perpetrators disappeared into rumor, and the community remained marked by its failure to act. What endured was the testimony of survivors, the ledgers cataloging lives as inventory, and the memory of chains rattling beneath a farmhouse that had seemed ordinary. The consequences were not neat conclusions but lingering scars, teaching that the true horror of the Sullivan basement was not only what one family did, but what an entire community allowed to happen while the sounds of suffering echoed beneath their feet. History leaves us with ruins, fragments, and unanswered questions. The Sullivan estate collapsed long ago, yet the memory of what was uncovered beneath its floors continues to echo. 47 children, their lives reduced to numbers in ledgers, remind us that evil often hides not in distant lands, but in plain sight, disguised by respectability and silence. The community that ignored the signs was forced to confront a truth that should never have been buried. Horrors flourish when people choose not to see. As we reflect on the events of 1834, the lesson is chillingly clear. Darkness does not always announce itself with open violence. It grows quietly behind locked doors while neighbors look away. The Sullivan family were not phantoms from folklore. They were people who lived, worshipped, traded, and presented themselves as pillars of society, all while turning their basement into a factory of suffering. That duality should unsettle us because it speaks to how easily trust can be weaponized and how silence can become complicity. The children freed from that cellar, those who lived and those who did not survive long after, symbolize more than one crime. They embody the cost of willful blindness and the necessity of vigilance. The Sullivan basement warns us that history's most terrifying shadows are often cast not by monsters from imagination, but by ordinary people who choose profit over humanity. If you've followed this story to its end, share it so others can remember what silence allowed to happen. Subscribe to our channel, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and join us as we continue to uncover America's most hidden horrors. Because every story like this is not just a record of the past, it is a reminder of what can happen again if the shadows are left unchallenged.